Among the winners in the ministerial reshuffle is Queensland MP Brough. He was Aboriginal Affairs Minister in the Howard government before losing his seat in the 2007 federal election. Brough returned to Parliament in 2013, winning Peter Slipper's former seat of Fisher. Now he's back on the front bench as Special Minister of State and Minister for Defence Materiel. Brough joins us now from Canberra. Brough, congratulations on your elevation to the ministry.
Thanks, Emma. It's good to be with you.
As the Minister for Defence Materiel, you'll have a key role in deciding where the new fleet of submarines will be built. Are you convinced that South Australia is the best place for that?
Well, that would be silly of me to speculate. I've been in this portfolio for several hours now. I've had the first briefing from the Chief as well as the head of the department. And I think you'll find that what the Prime Minister has said, that these decisions will obviously go to the National Security Committee. They'll obviously then go to the Cabinet. So my role will be quite, I guess, limited in that respect.
You're a former member of the Defence Forces, so you must have a personal view.
Look, I was an infantry soldier and captain, so far from being submarines. What I do know is that I want to very strongly support Australian defence industry. We have a strong, viable and vibrant defence industry that can actually export, and part of that will be our innovation. Do you realise that beyond the CSIRO, defence actually has probably the next largest component of PhDs running around, so we should draw upon that as part of this innovation that the Prime Minister's talking about.
So reports say it comes down to 3 competing bids by France, Japan and Germany. Is the most likely outcome, do you think, that we'll see an arrangement where at least half, perhaps, or more of the build will be done in South Australia with the rest offshore?
Look, I just can't speculate. What I can tell you is that we have to come up with what's going to be best for Australia's long-term defence. You cannot put at harm and at risk our submariners or our maritime safety by getting a second-best option. So all of those things have to be considered in totality, not in isolation. So that's what I'm sure that the Minister, Marise Payne, and the rest of our colleagues will consider.
How soon should we expect a decision?
Well, again, I haven't had that briefing, but obviously the last government failed to make a decision. We do know that we have to make one sooner rather than later, and as soon as we have something more concrete, I'll be only too happy to pass it on to you.
How big an issue was the submarine build in the removal of Tony Abbott as Prime Minister?
In the end game, not at all, but perhaps in some people's mind it was about the breakdown of process. I've reflected on this a few times today, and that is that as part of the Howard government I understood what a cabinet was, what cabinet decisions, and then using your backbench committees effectively, having trust and respect both within cabinet, within the backbench and to and from the Prime Minister. When you have those things, the sort of argy-bargy you've seen with the example you gave are avoided. And that's what we are seeking to avoid, consulting broadly, bringing everyone into the tent and all moving forward in the one direction.
In your new role, you'll be working closely with Marise Payne, the first female Defence Minister. Are you relieved that the number of women in the Cabinet has now increased by more than 100%?
I'm delighted. I've known Marise for nearly 20 years. We're great friends, and I really am looking forward to that relationship. I've already been down there to her office, and of course the other ladies bring a great depth of talent to the ministry, and of course having a young mum there with all of those constraints and challenges that all young mums have when they return to the workforce just shows how real this cabinet is. We have, it's real life experience.
Still, though, less than 25% of the Cabinet is female. The party has a way to go, doesn't it, before it gets to anywhere near like equality? Yeah,
look, I think we have a big way to go, not just within the party, but within government, within politics, to how do we attract more young people, of male and female, but of course predominantly female. And I'm open to suggestions on how we do that, and I can play my part in that as well.
Now, you've already indicated that as Special Minister of State, you're hoping to change the voting system. What can you do to make it, in your words, more transparent?
Well, if you have a look at how it works now, you have people with minuscule percentages of the vote harvesting preferences from across the political spectrum. And the point I was making earlier today was if you have a party on the hard left being elected on the preferences of the hard right, that's hardly demonstrative of what people are trying to achieve. So is that And if people don't know and have no transparency about how these cascading preferences flow, how does that work for democracy and, as I say, transparency? So if we can clear those issues up, if we can give people more confidence and they don't have to fill out a metre-long ballot paper in order to make a preference themselves rather than those foisted upon them, then perhaps we're heading in the right direction. So there's some of the principles that I'll apply to it.
Is that the kind of reform that can be achieved before the end of this parliament?
Well, we'll know in 12 months. You know, I think that we have to take a long-term view of this sort of stuff and not talking about electoral cycles, but what's good for democracy. If you want the public to be engaged, make sure that they feel their democracy is valued. And the way you do that is you put your party political ideology aside and how it may benefit you, and you look at what's good for our long-term democratic processes. So if we do that, there's every chance that we can get these reforms through before the next election.
Under John Howard, you were Assistant Treasurer, Minister for Indigenous Affairs and Minister for Families. Why were you not part of Tony Abbott's front bench?
Oh, probably a question you'd have to direct to Tony, I think. You know, in the Liberal Party, the Prime Minister gets to make those choices. And Tony Abbott did say going into the last election that he had faith in his team and that he was going to stick with his team. So he would have been just branded by the media and by others that, you know, he's not keeping a promise if he had elevated people like myself. So there was rational reasons why he stuck with the team that he took there.
But he did do a reshuffle in the brief time he was Prime Minister?
Yeah, he did, and he saw fit to promote other people, and that's the prerogative of Liberal Prime Ministers.
Tony Abbott described himself as the Prime Minister for Indigenous Affairs. As a former Indigenous Affairs Minister yourself, do you think he lived up to the expectations that might have attached to that?
Tony has a great heart for Indigenous affairs. There is no doubt about that whatsoever. It's a much harder thing to actually deliver on the ground, and I think sometimes what we think is right or what we hope is right doesn't necessarily achieve the outcomes. So, you know, I know that he and I differed quite a large step of the way, if you like, but there are still some great achievements there that he will point to, and one of them is that he has elevated this in the national debate just by the Prime Minister being up there on the Cape for a week, taking so many other ministers up. That does send a clear message. So we should not underestimate the role that he has played in Indigenous affairs in his 2 years as Prime Minister.
If the public is to judge you on your past record, what should they make of the Northern Territory intervention of which you conceived and delivered?
Yeah, it was a work that was never completed to the way that I had seen it. I saw it as a moment in time to give families some breathing space, to ensure that the crimes that were being committed against men and women and children would have police there, that would have police checks, would have the nurses and the schools, all the things that we consider normal. But that was only for then to have a conversation about where we go to next. And I think that is where it all broke down. That never occurred. And now when you hear people like the Western Australian Premier talking about closing down remote communities, you can't do that either in isolation. It has to be community by community as to what is going to be best for your children and your future. If you do that on the basis of an honest discussion, then perhaps we have a way through what is a very challenging situation.
On another matter, do you regret the role you played in ending the career of the former Speaker, Peter Slipper?
No, I don't regret doing what I did. I felt that as a member who lived in that electorate, that I didn't want to see that sort of level of representation again, so I joined the party. I became the FDC chairman, and Mr Slipper took another direction and deserted the Liberal Party, sided with the Labor Party, became the Speaker, and the rest is history.
Well, it's recent history. You asked Peter Slipper's staffer James Ashby to make copies of Peter Slipper's private diary. Was that appropriate?
No, that's not correct. I mean, I know that that's what's been reported, but that is not exactly the right description of what occurred. But what I can tell you is that I stand by every action that I've taken.
What part of what I just said then was not accurate?
Well, all of these matters have been canvassed and dealt with by the courts.
But you've previously admitted that you asked for the procurement of those diaries. You've admitted on the public record.
When you ask me a question, I'm trying to give you a straight answer, and the reality is that what we're now dealing with, the matters that have been dealt with Mr Slipper, with the courts and with Mr Ashby and his lawyers over a very long period of time, and I guess what we're reflecting upon is in fact old politics, not about the future. What we're discussing here today is not going to help where the country's going, and the matter has been dealt with comprehensively. So we can churn over it again, but it really doesn't take us anywhere, and what I'm about is the future.
But you're now a minister, and so that, as you would know, comes with it another level of scrutiny. And Peter Slipper was in fact acquitted by the courts, and it was about $1,000 that was being argued. Tony Abbott, by contrast, paid back more than that after wrongly using taxpayers' money to attend a colleague's wedding. On reflection, do you regret the cost to taxpayers of pursuing that case, the cost to Peter Slipper's health and reputation?
Look, I don't regret what I have undertaken, what I have done. Mr Slippers was able to make his own choices. He did so. The courts also fulfilled their roles. The reality is it's the Commonwealth that picked up that tab, and to try and make a suggestion that what Tony Abbott did and what Mr Slipper was accused of is in fact totally false. One was about actually taking dockets and changing them, in other words changing documents to do with financial irregularities with the Commonwealth, and the other one was an interpretation. But the federal court found that nothing,
well, the court found nothing
no, I'm just saying that
improper was done.
The point I'm making is that the two situations, there was no suggestion at any time that what Tony Abbott had done was anything other than a misinterpretation of the rules. What the AFP did was elect to take Mr Slipper to court because they believed they had a prima facie case of criminal behaviour. Brough didn't say that.
On referral from the government. Federal Court Justice Stephen Reres said that you, Mr Ashby, and another political staffer worked in combination for the predominant purpose of causing political damage to Mr Slipper. He said you'd entered into what amounted to a political conspiracy to advance the interests of the LNP and Mr Brough.
So, Emma, did you read what the full court of the federal court overrode that? You want to read that paragraph out, which said that was totally wrong, that finding by Judge Reres was wrong? Is that not what the ABC does? So when you have the full bench override that decision, is not that relevant to you and your listeners? You have just read out something that was totally discredited by the full bench of the federal court. I find that extraordinary. Why wouldn't you actually read out the paragraph which found that finding was incorrect?
It didn't quite find that it was incorrect.
Oh, yes, it did. Yes, it did. And if you'd like the paragraph, I'd be delighted for you to read it to your listeners tomorrow night.
The finding...
100%, Emma, 100% said that was incorrect and that I had no case. Why aren't you reading that out? Well,
there was never a case brought against you per se.
Thank you.
This was a case against Mr Slipper.
So, exactly. And when the matter was appealed, why will you not read out precisely what the full bench found? Isn't that what our justice system is about? You have elected to read out an earlier finding which was overruled by the full bench of the federal court. I find that an extraordinary thing for you to do.
Finally, I wanted to ask you now, ironically, you have carriage over the entitlement system, and do you think that the system does need to be overhauled?
Well, it is being overhauled, and Prime Minister Abbott obviously undertook to do that, so we'll let that play out. That's been done, I believe, through PM&C. I've had a briefing on it today. For my own rule, I have my own diary on my website for the ABC or anyone else to see. I have all of my entitlements, which I've undertaken to do, up there for everyone to see, and where I go, so they can ascertain for themselves whether or not I am providing value for money for the Commonwealth.
Brough, thanks very much for joining us.
Good to be with you, Emma. Thank you.